So, hello, Amber. I'm glad you could join us. I'm sorry we didn't have you this year at the festival in Oak Cliff, but I'm really happy that we get to have a question and answer session with you via Zoom. I wonder if we could just start by talking about how this project started. I think we were working together at Southern Methodist University when you first mentioned the project to me several years ago. And so I got to kind of hear a little bit about the formation of it. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit just about how you came into contact with Guillermo Gomez Peña and La Pocha Nostra and how this project was initiated.
I started working on the film in 2016. I was living in Mexico City and I got to know Guillermo through a community of artists that I was part of, like performance artists in Mexico City. And I would go to his, Guillermo lives part-time in Mexico City and part-time in San Francisco. So I would go to his house in Mexico City for these big Christmas parties or New Year's parties, and they were so fun. And they were really these like art parties. And the thing that really struck me about Guillermo right from the beginning was the difference between being in his orbit and his community in Mexico City versus like anything that I've experienced in the States. So what was fun about these parties was that they were very intergenerational. And also at these parties, people were really like hanging out and making art together. Usually in the States, the parties for artists are like kind of bougie and everyone's sort of vying for funding or program, whatever. Everyone's trying to meet the curator. That wasn't the case in these parties. Guillermo would say to everyone, like, everyone bring a 2-minute performance. And at 3 a.m, we'd all do our 2-minute performances for each other. And they were wild, So, I was really struck by that community. I really loved getting to know Guillermo. And then after one of those parties, I woke up in the morning and actually my long-term collaborator and romantic partner at the time, when we woke up, she said, Nadia Granados, who appears very heavily throughout the film, she said to me, "Hey, has anyone made a film about Guillermo? Because someone should." And I remember we Googled it, and there is a documentary about a very famous and seminal piece of art that he did called Couple in the Cage, in collaboration with the amazing artist Coco Fusco. There's a documentary about that film, and he's made some other films that are like performative, but no one's made a documentary about him. And so when I realized that, I called his house that morning, and his wife answered the phone, Electronica, who's also appears throughout the film. And I said to her, "Hey, Nadia just said, suggested I make a film about Guillermo. What do you think?" And she said, "Oh, that's so funny. I woke up this morning and said that you should make a film about Guillermo too." So it was like it was a beautiful moment. And then I started, and then it was a 6-year process. And I finished the film last summer and premiered it almost a year ago last summer.
Well, that's a cool environment to kind of dig into. I mean, you see quite a bit of that in the film, where there's not like a super clear separation between when life and art are just sort of like commingling, when it's just an aspect of like the subculture of the people who are part of La Pocha Nostra or around La Pocha Nostra.
I think, the thing is that that particular community in Mexico City of performance artists, like there are no grants, there's no support. Whereas in the States, it's like there's 2 grants for like 5 billion people, So it's almost this feeling of like when there aren't a lot of resources. And also performance art, unlike film, is an art form where you really use like your pen and your glass and your hat and your body, although you can also use more expensive objects, but like it really is about like the body, like where you are, what's around you, and just like recontextualizing those things to create a multiplicity of meaning. So it can be cheaper,
Right.
than like a $1 billion-trillion film budget or something like that. So that's a part of it too, is like the economics of the art form of performance, and then also the fact of like not having a lot of resources. Maybe it's like um, a lot of the old school experimental film communities, right? Where it was, and maybe even now there are some, but we could go into a tangent about that, I'm sure. But anyway, where there's like not a lot of resources, but there's a lot of community. So when there's less resource, and I also think about like a queer aesthetic, although queer aesthetic means a billion things, but like, I often say that like the lifestyle creates the aesthetic, and there's a lot of appropriation of like a more dirty aesthetic or a more like jaggedy aesthetic that comes from like many different communities. But we could talk about like the queer community, because when you're under resourced, you kind of like create something out of you create a look that has that in it, because that's what the necessity is. It's not just like advertising, like subverting that aesthetic.
Performance art has been part of your like sort of practice in film and video. Like, I mean, obviously it's the subject of this film, but I know your work previously mostly from the short films you've made, many of them with Nadia, like you said. I wonder if you could talk about the role of performance in sort of like your body of work as a whole, and how that sort of prepared you for making this film, maybe.
Yeah. This film is sort of the culmination of a lot of my artistic interests since I began making films, which was 25 years ago. So it's beautiful in that way, because it really allowed me to push and explore some of the things that I've been working with, such as like borders and their relationship to bodies, queer representation, and a sort of relational way of media making between bodies and people, and different demographics and positionalities, and like dynamics of oppression. My first performance art film, I think, was my senior thesis in college. When I decided, I had been to India on a study abroad program, and as someone who was raised Buddhist, I was really struck by the sort of spiritual tourism that was taking place in India around Buddhist pilgrimage sites. So I went to India again to make a documentary about that, and I wanted to make this like expose on like these tourists in India. But when I got there, I was like, wait a second, I'm one of these people, So then why don't I use my own body instead of, like, I felt the vulnerability even then as a young person. I felt some sort of problematic and vulnerability even in filming someone, that like knowing that I was filming someone to make my own point, that was maybe negative, or using analysis, or critical. And so I was like, well, how about me? Like, I'm a white person, I'm middle class, I'm from the States, and here I am practicing Buddhism. And so I turned the camera on myself, and that started a tradition for me of like really using my own body to investigate different larger kind of socio-political realities or thoughts or like situations. And that's performative in a way, although yeah, because my body symbolizes different things. Like it symbolizes um, being a cisgendered female body, it symbolizes being a queer body, a white body, a middle-aged body, right? So all these things, and then when you put my body in juxtaposition to other bodies, that juxtaposition creates other meanings. So that's kind of the way that I've been working with performance for all these years in different ways. But yeah, this film really brought that together.
I mean, that was another question I was going to ultimately ask, was about how you used yourself in the film to kind of implicate your own position and identity. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's interesting to think that you're doing not only that, which is like part of how we understand the position of the author or the role of authorship in, say, ethnographic filmmaking, which is, something that's big in experimental film these days, versus the use of the camera just purely to document a performance and, say, the history of, performance art and video art. So it feels like it's a kind of nice coming together of those two things, which feels like two separate impulses that now end up like very much, related and entwined.
I really didn't want to put myself in the film. All along the way, I was like, this is so stupid because this is like a great performance artist and a really important person in the history of art. Like, why should I be in this film? But like more and more, I would workshop the film. I did labs with the film, and people were like, that's the most interesting part. So is the dynamic between you and him. And it felt unavoidable because both Guillermo's and my work really deal with representational politics in art. And so it felt like it would be really off to not make that visible in the film. So it was important for me to like be a character in the film too, and in my performance persona. And I chose the naked director because I was thinking about, and I have been thinking about for the past 25 years, like what the power dynamics are. This is an age-old documentary question, but like, what are the power dynamics between director and protagonist, aka subject, in a documentary film or in any film, but let's say documentary. What are the implications around that? Like what gets exploited, who gets privileged, all those questions. And so to play with that, I chose to have this symbol of like a naked body, because nudity symbolizes metaphorically vulnerability. So I thought it was kind of a funny dissonance to have a director who's also naked, who's symbolizing that vulnerability. And in the beginning of the film, when you see me and I'm lip syncing his words with no clothes on, that's the ultimate, it's like a performative gesture towards these documentary questions. And so it's really, this film is really about documentary, but if you're not like a documentary studies person, then you're not going to get that. But yeah.
Right. Yeah. Maybe that brings up a larger question of collaboration also.
Collaboration has always been really important to me. I've been collaborating. I'm a collaborator in all the ways. And so I'm really excited actually about the film that we're going to collaborate on, Mike, that we're planning on. So watch out for that, everyone. I think what I want to say is my most successful collaboration has been with Nadia Granados, who I've made like a whole body of work with, and who actually ended up being the creative producer on 100 Ways to Cross the Border as well. And we've been collaborating for 10 years. And yeah, it's like collaborations are like romantic relationships. It's like you really have to figure out your system. Some of them work, some of them don't. So, but I think it's an important thing, and film is always collaborative. It's true.
Thank you for this wonderful film. Thank you for your involvement in the festival. I'm glad we got to have you at Oak Cliff, even if we couldn't have you here in person. And I look forward to being able to show more of your work in the future.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.